Hello everyone. Okay, in this session today we're going to do about two of the principles of the US Constitution. The first one being separation of powers and the second one being checks and balances. The main thing to understand about the American Constitution, as we did when we did the origins in the earlier lesson, was how the founding fathers, their main aim was to create limited government. They feared governments that could abuse their powers. And in fact, this is epitomised in the Federalist Papers. I mentioned them in the Origins video, this document which was done by the Founding Fathers, or three of them anyway, to justify and explain what they meant by elements of the Constitution. And in fact, the Federalist Papers, I'm pretty sure there's a copy in the library actually, looks like that. Now, one of the authors was Madison. Okay, you can get it on Google, so I just typed in Federalist Papers 51. It explains why they had these two principles of separation of powers and checks and balances. So James Madison, particularly about checks and balances, his justification for this was, it may be a reflection on human nature that such devices, i.e. checks and balances, should be necessary to control the abuses of government. But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls and government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place oblige it to control itself. A dependence on the people is, no doubt, the primary control on the government, but experience has taught mankind the necessity of other precautions. So, in other words, governments by their nature might be tempted to abuse their power, and therefore it needs to have some controls placed upon it, which is what this idea of separation of powers and checks and balances is all about. Okay, so firstly, separation of powers is probably the easiest one. Okay, as the name implies, what it basically refers to is this idea that no one person can be in more than one branch of government. So, for example, no individual can be like president or a member of Congress at the same time, or be a member of the judiciary and a member of Congress at the same time. And this is going against the model which Britain had at the time and still has today, whereby there's more of a fusion. So, for example, Boris Johnson is an MP and also head of the executive. The Americans, founding fathers, feared that might lead to tyranny, one person having far too much power, and so therefore they were very keen to separate it all out. Now, in your work booklet, there are 3 or 4 questions. So let's try to look at the 4 questions, actually, well, 5 actually. 4 of them use the Bennett books, page 27 to 29, about separation of powers. And then finally, there's a think question, which is always leads you with dread, does it not? Trying to think about, does the UK have any separation of powers, or has there been an increase of separation of powers perhaps in the UK? Yes and no. So trying to think about some points there. Again, I'm just trying to think about the potential comparative questions, so it's worth trying to think about how it relates to the US Constitution. Okay, now the second part, which is the main focus, is something called checks and balances. This is the bit which Madison was referring to in what I have just read out to you. And what checks and balances basically are is this idea that every branch of government is given certain powers. However, those powers need to be checked, i.e. controlled or limited by another branch of government. So, for example, the Constitution states clearly that the US President is Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. That, in theory, gives him a huge amount of power, doesn't it? Because he's got the army at his disposal, this instrument of tyranny, potentially. However, the Constitution also says, but Congress has the power of the purse. In other words, Congress has the power of spending money. And so the President cannot have an army if Congress hasn't paid for it, essentially. So there you've got an example of a power being given to one branch, and then the other branch, Congress, actually trying to limit that power in some way, having some control over that power. And what you'll find in the Constitution throughout are a number of these checks and balances, trying to give one power to one and then take that power away by another branch or try to limit it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to email this out to you. This is the A3 version. Obviously you're going to get an email, so it won't be A3. Okay, of this table called "What are the checks and balances within the United States Constitution?" Now let me just explain it. It's going a bit breeding. I'm just going to try to explain it. Let me explain this to you. So down the left hand side, you've got the checks by. So the checks by the legislature, checks by the executive, checks by the judiciary. And along the top, we've got checks on the legislature, checks on the executive, and checks on the judiciary. So this first box here is shaded in grey because this is the legislature checking itself. And the Constitution doesn't give any particular powers. No, it kind of cancels itself out. Okay. This next box, though, are checks by the legislature on the executive. So you need to use the Bennett book to find out what checks does the Constitution give the executive over, so the legislature over the executive. What checks does the legislature have over the judiciary? It goes in this box. Okay, next one down here. On this one, you need to put on what checks does the executive, i.e. the presidency, have over the legislature, i.e. Congress. This is hashed in because the executive doesn't check itself. And then here, what checks does the executive have over the judicial branch? And then this final box on the bottom here, this one is what checks does the judiciary have over the legislature, and what checks does the judiciary have over the executive? Okay, I hope you can vaguely see that. So what you need to do is to complete that table. As I said, the Bennett book is the one to use first of all. Let me just find out what page it's on because I can't remember. It's all on Teams anyhow. Let's have a quick look. Checks and balances, separation of powers. 28 onwards. Okay. Now, some of you may notice there's a little box 2.5 where it just kind of highlights some of those things there. I do want to do the reading on this though, with all the subheadings, because it explains them and it gives you some nice examples as well. And again, if you're doing an essay, then you need some examples. You might also want to have a look at the Jenkins textbook as well. It's a bit more recent than the Bennett one, so again, it might have some more up-to-date examples. So if you do those two things for me, then the next video I'll do, we'll discuss how effective are these checks and balances. And I'll produce a PowerPoint slide or something with some kind of examples of it being effective or not.